My name is Frances Anderton. I'm a long-time journalist focusing on architecture, design, and art. And I've just been supporting MOCA with the production of this series with my colleague here, Livia Mandul. We were brought in to help out with an initiative that MOCA's been running for a whole year, which is outreach having to do with issues of climate crisis and how the art world is dealing with it. It was born of an initiative launched in 2020. That was the founding of the MOCA Environmental Council. MOCA was the first major museum to dedicate resources and attention to the climate crisis and the art world's responsibilities in relation to it. This past year, the museum's been hosting programs, exhibitions, tours, and conversations, illuminating many dimensions of this crisis that we face. It's been supported by the Manna 2 Fund, and the panel that you're about to witness is part of a series that is part of that overall outreach, and the series is called Art for Earth's Sake. 5 conversations during which the art world turns the mirror upon itself, considering both the artistic expression of collective anxieties around our warming planet, and also asking the question, what about the carbon footprint of the art world itself, which I think we all, are very much aware of how it too has heated up over the last few decades and is arguably both an interpreter and perhaps an embodiment even of the late capitalist place that we find ourselves in now. So coming up, we're going to be, in coming weeks, we're going to be exploring topics including the greening of art facilities and art fairs. We're going to look at environmental justice as it has been played out and expressed in art in Los Angeles, particularly by Los Angeles artists. We're going to talk about ways in which the mediums chosen by artists is itself part of the story that they're trying to tell in connection with tackling the anxieties around the climate. And I guess that brings us to today's topic, which I think is a very, very interesting one. We've obviously all been hearing the buzz about NFTs. We've all heard the buzz about the crypto mining and so on, and Ethereum Merge, and there's been a lot of conversation about that. It's definitely something that is quite a heated conversation in the art world. But I think, that's just one piece of a larger conversation about sort of art on screens and how art has infiltrated the screen at every level, from the AR on our phones to artwork that's appearing on digital billboards, energy-intensive immersive installations that are just routine now in museum shows. So we have 3 really incredibly talented people to take on aspects of this conversation. The artist Glenn Kaino and Nancy Baker Cahill, who'll join in a moment, and to lead the conversation, a brilliant person who piqued our interest when we read that she had a particular interest in digital culture and the absurd. The sort of putting together of those two was immediately interesting. Her name is Charlotte Kent, PhD. She's assistant professor. She's assistant professor of visual culture at Montclair State University. She's a prolific arts writer. Her research investigates the social implications of digital culture, and she has written extensively over the last year about the emergent technology of blockchain. Charlotte, welcome. Over to you.
Well, welcome, everyone. I am going to start our conversation today on art, technology, and the environment 10,000 years ago. So 10,000 years ago, the planet, by best estimates, had about 10 million people on it. And there were disappearing wild resources. So 2 things happened. People moved out of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and others planted themselves, and they domesticated animals, and they cultivated plants. It's what's known as the agricultural revolution. They owned land, and with that came a set of what's often called as agro-logistics and philosophies. With that need for land and recognizing individual property, there was the development of wealth and status, inheritance, trade, money, power. ideas that became really important and also allowed, with the surplus of food, for things like tool makers and musicians and scribes and priests and soldiers and athletes and kings. And those led eventually to guilds and orchestras and libraries and temples and armies and games and dynasties and cities. The food was more plentiful but less nutritional, and it required more work. People were vulnerable to disease. They needed to learn how to do waste management. There were issues of weather and pests and invasion and oppression. This set of agri-logistics was formalized by Aristotle's categorization, and ideas of logic like the law of non-contradiction. Two things can't both be true. This piece of land cannot belong to both you and me. Ideas like the law of the excluded middle. There can be no in-between categories, even though a meadow has both grass and birds in it. With this development of the land as it pursued, by 1750, there were 800 million people, by best estimates, on the planet. And there were new scarcities in land and energy. Because of enclosure of land, there was less farmland available for people, they were moving elsewhere. And because of deforestation, there were no more trees, and so there started to be a need for other things like coal. It's what's known as the Industrial Revolution, and it produced a new set of logics, often associated with capitalism. Machines, not people, became the means of production. And those mining practices have continued in a set of logics. And I mention all of this because it's so easy when we talk about technology and our anxieties around its use of resources and its energy expenditures to get into a utopian and nostalgic sort of pre-industrial era desire. But the Industrial Revolution was an answer to the problems that were produced by the Agricultural Revolution. And now we face a similar situation. We have new scarcities that we need to address, and we have a new revolution that we need to think about in terms of what's coming next. It's easy to blame the use of technology devices for their energy and resource use. But the fashion industry requires 5,000 gallons of water for a t-shirt and a pair of jeans. Some estimate that by 2030, the fashion industry's production will surpass world water supply by 40%. That's 7 years away. Or the film industry, since I'm in LA right now. Blockbuster films are, by various different estimates, supposed to take somewhere between 2,800 and 3,400 metric tons of CO2 per production. What do these numbers mean? What are we doing with them? How do they help us get forward? One of the things I want to say is that the point isn't to blame one industry, but to realize that we are all participants in the current disequilibrium. Ecology used to be known as the economy of nature because it was how life forms organize their desires. How could a farmer 7,000 years ago have imagined the production of soy fields in Iowa today? How could a factory worker in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1800 have imagined the world of people driving Teslas? How can we imagine what we will need to generate? We have to simply start taking risks and doing it. We can engage more thoughtfully, however, by knowing these histories. We can inquire about the epistemologies, the logistics of our tools, how they're being developed, how we're using them, and how we might use them differently. Our word for art comes from the Roman word ars. But the Greek word that Plato used in his extraordinary anxiety about art and society was the word techne, the same word that is the root for technology, a type of skilled making. Art and technology are not distinct, but skilled making, especially of our time. Artists using these emergent technologies give us the opportunity to think through what they are, what the logistics are that they are presenting to us, and how we might interfere with the logics as they're being designed to produce the thing we actually need and we desire next. So In our conversation, I am pleased to have Nancy and Glenn so that we can talk about how, with their own practices, with their own use of these art on screens, what have they learned and how can they help us begin to think through what we can do in the disequilibrium of our own day. So Nancy is going to speak first and present her work. She is a new media artist who examines systemic power, selfhood, and embodied consciousness through drawing and shared immersive space. She's the founder and director of Fourth Wall, a free augmented reality art platform exploring resistance and inclusive creative expression. Nancy, it's you.
Hi, everyone. Charlotte, thank you so much for framing this conversation so beautifully and compellingly. I'm really excited to talk about it. So my videos gave us a little bit of trouble, so I'm going to foreground each one. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each one. I'm going to show you 3. And each of these projects, although only 2 of them are technically NFTs and involved specifically and directly with blockchain, I do think of them as a triad, as a triumvirate. They are all interrelated, and one has inspired the other. So we will start with a project called Contract Killers from 2021. I created this project in collaboration with an art lawyer named Sarah Odenkirk. Some of you may know her. And it was born out of some very agitated conversations we'd had after this fever had emerged about NFTs. And I had been thinking about blockchain and working with blockchain since around 2016, but had never quite found the right conceptual vehicle to do so. And it never quite felt like it was in alignment with my practice at that moment. And so I had done some research, and I was initially excited, as I know a lot of artists were, by the idea of trustless trust and disintermediation and automated remuneration. I think arguably that was the most exciting part, the fact that artists wouldn't have to, using this technology, we wouldn't have to chase down money that we're owed for our labors, which is a problem that remains. But the more research I did, and as I watched this collective fever reach a certain pitch, it became clear to me that a lot of the promises of Web3, a lot of the promises of this technology, while interesting conceptually and while compelling in theory, weren't actually playing out that way. And in fact, a lot of inequities were being simply reproduced, and that it hadn't quite lived into all of the exciting things that we were hoping it would. So the first project, this project Contract Killers, is a project of critique, unapologetic critique, and it uses the contractual language of blockchain, these agreements, these consensus agreements, to look at broken social contracts of all kinds. And the reason why I used AR versus some other medium for this is because there's a certain ephemerality to AR as well. And when we think about broken contracts and we think about broken promises, there's a way in which our hopes and dreams and expectations simply dissolve. And so it felt important to me to cite these interventions, these AR interventions, in various locations. So what you're going to see is a dissolving handshake, a kind of age-old symbol of agreement and trust. And you will see these dissolving handshakes in 3 different settings. One is in front of the, quote, Hall of Justice here in LA, and this was intended to critique the carceral state and prison industrial complex. There's another over a pile of fiat currency to critique the externalities of late capitalism. And one in front of City Hall, which has been unfortunately the target of a number of my projects, as a reminder of all the broken promises to our citizens and to the lack of accountability that I see not just in local politics, but of course in federal and global politics as well. And I will just say that this question of accountability is crucial. So, and you'll see this threaded through at least the first 2 works. So Sarah, there's this term smart contract, and I think a lot of people thought it meant like an actual contract, like a legal contract, and of course it doesn't, it's algorithmic. But we wanted to actually create a contract that both condensed the agreement and solidified the agreement between artist and collector. And so anyone who bought one of these NFTs not only received this smarter contract, or as Sarah calls them, armatures, but also could opt into an actual physical object. We wanted to have a symbol of something that was solid, that was actually immutable. And because we made it out of resin, it probably will survive any apocalypse. It'll probably be here long after the cockroaches, so, which is environmentally very unsound. So this is contract. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is on the question of accountabilities, and specifically asymmetrical accountabilities. Obviously, the environment was also top of mind, and this was at the heat of what Charlotte earlier described, a lot of finger pointing and blaming around artists using Ethereum versus proof-of-stake blockchains. And I felt, because we were talking about accountabilities, that it was important to mint this on a proof-of-stake blockchain. This was before I understood that proof-of-stake blockchains, which are easier on the environment, come with their own externalities that are economic and unfair. So this is Contract Killers. So the next project is called Mushroom Cloud. And I was invited last December, I guess, at Miami Basel to create a large-scale monumental AR intervention in Miami. And I thought, well, Miami, of all places, is one of the most endangered cities next to New Orleans in the United States. And this is an opportunity to talk about accountability all over again, but really expand the conversation and deepen and enrich it a little bit as it relates to human-caused climate catastrophe. And at the same time, rather than standing from a strictly critical point of view, invite the audience into a different consideration of how we might collectively survive a sixth extinction. And so I decided to, through lots of conversation with Sarah, and this is the second time we collaborated, I had also done a tremendous amount of research on mycelial networks. I've been interested in looking to nature for better systems, basically using biomimicry to imagine better futures, better systems. Because when I at least look at when I look at how things are going right now, it doesn't seem like our current systems are working all that well. So how could we build, imagine, live into a kind of interdependence that will allow us to survive using these natural models as models? They are bespoke, they are in and of themselves, but we are also a part of it, and our survival depends on them. So, a mushroom cloud was pretty much the most, I couldn't think of a better symbol for human-caused climate crisis and intervention. And then I also wanted to, but again, because I wanted to invite that conversation after I decided that I wanted the mushroom cloud to dissolve into, in the sky, this vast mycelial network. And at each intersection of each branch, there would be a node. And the idea was, and we created additional sculptures that were single nodes, the idea was that you, the collector, would imagine yourself and recognize yourself as a node in a larger network, a larger interdependent network. And you would then you would use this distributive system and network to distribute these nodes to other people who are important to you. So everything was sort of baked in. Sarah wrote a blueprint toward this agreement and acknowledging this kind of mutual shared accountability. And I also, this is just from a kind of a technical perspective, I really wanted to engage the bodies of the viewers. And there's a term called ergonomic awe. And it's when you look up, when you're in, when you're in like Muir Woods or you're in a cathedral, and you look up and you experience a kind of wonder. There's something that happens to you, to your physiognomy, that allows that wonder to kind of somehow find its way into your body on a cellular level. And I think that's one beautiful form of what we call embrainment, a way in which embodiment is actually embrained in the body. So I really wanted this to be a very interactive piece, and I guess that's all I'll say about it for now. So let's show Mushroom Cloud. realized it's very clear this is not Miami, this is New York. This was part of the Tribeca Film Festival. We actually, one of the things I love about this project, about Mushroom Cloud, is that it actually migrated to a variety of different endangered coastlines. And the one thing I forgot to say is when we brought it here to LA, I really wanted the project to walk its talk. So I was very fortunate to collaborate with an artist named Amelia Winger-Bearskin, and together we collaborated on a separate piece, a separate NFT related to this called Proximities, and it comes from my Slipstream series, video series. And basically the idea was when the NFTs sold, the portion of the proceeds would go to Amelia. Amelia has her own, she's an incredible podcast called Wapum.codes, and she's part of a whole land-back climate justice network herself. So the idea is that those funds would go to Amelia, and she would then distribute them and redistribute them to her networks. So that was also a really exciting part of the project, and it continues to live into that. So finally, I want to show you Corpus, which is not an NFT, but it really is part of this suite, because it is also looking to the future. It's seeking better systems. I was invited by the Berggruen Institute, where I was an artist fellow, to create a future human to be installed at the Bradbury Building. For any of you that are Blade Runner fans, this is one of our iconic buildings here in LA. It was a huge honor. And there was this, the Bradbury Building has this vast 5-story atrium and glass ceilings because apparently it was created as one of the first socialist buildings. The designer was inspired by a novel by Edward Bellamy and wanted each floor to get equal amounts of light. So that felt to me like a really beautiful opportunity for a piece that really is intended to be not just a massive 5-story holobiont, and a holobiont is a single organism made up of multiple organisms, but also toward the idea of a body politic, a body that represents many different interdependent constituencies. And so the body itself of Corpus is made of machine and silicon. It's made of carbon-based life, botanical life. It's made of microbiome, as we all are now, and a kind of blended code and DNA represented abstractly, as you'll see. And I just wanted this holobiont, this big giant corpus, and corpus, for those of you that code, know that corpus also refers to a data set. I wanted it to dwarf us as viewers because it seems crucial to me that to advance and to move forward and to survive, we need to decenter ourselves. We need to decenter human knowledge and the hegemony of that knowledge and the way in which we somehow think that we have a supreme grasp on what's what, when we clearly don't. And when you'll hear the soundtrack is equally blended. This is an ambiguously gendered figure. Its heartbeat is made of the fetal heartbeat, an adult human heartbeat, a heartbeat of a whale, and the heartbeat of the cosmos, 2 black holes colliding. And it's all been interpolated through an AI. And the last thing I want to say is that Corpus, to me, the other opportunity of Corpus and the other I hope what you take away is this imagination of the body. You'll notice that it's somewhat transparent, translucent in places. I really do imagine the body and future bodies as a process versus an object. And I think part of what we're all trying to talk about and think about today is how do we adapt new processes and not operate with any sense of sort of finality or finite games, for those of you who have read Infinite and Finite Games. Okay, here's Corpus. That's Corpus from below. Well, you're getting Corpus from all views. I will say this was a feat of engineering, and I am so grateful to my team. It took us weeks to install this. The Bradbury has a series of repeating patterns that made it very, very difficult for the eye of the camera to find it. Okay, I think that's good. Thanks. Okay, I happily cede the floor.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Glenn is an artist known internationally for his expansive vision and activist-minded practice, which encompasses painting, sculpture, installation, performance, monumental public art, theatrical production, and feature film. And he is here to speak with us now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I'm just going to talk about one project, and then we'll get this show on the road. So this photo is a photo of Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman at the 1968 Olympic Games. It's an iconic photo in the history of civil rights. Time magazine calls it one of the top 100 photos of all time. I first saw it when I was in high school, and it was so impactful to me that I had a small 4x5-inch version of it taped to the corner of my iMac in my studio for as long as I can remember. And one day, about 11 years ago, a friend of mine walked in to the studio, and he pointed at the photo, and he was like, "Coach Smith, you want to meet him?" And I was like, "Wait a minute, hold on. Coach is only the name that you call someone who you know who's your coach," because I didn't even, to be honest, it's black and white, I didn't know if he was alive. And so sure enough, my friend walked to the corner of the studio, and he starts texting someone. He comes back, and he's like, "They want to meet you." And I'm like, "Get the fuck out of here, really?" And sure enough, they live in Atlanta, and they invited me over to their house. And so I booked 2 tickets on Expedia on my phone, like right then. 2 days later, I show up at his house, and he shakes my hand at the door, and he sits me on the couch, and he played the race that he won, men's 200-meter. He sat sitting on the couch, and he narrated every thought that he was thinking step by step, And I got chills. And an hour on the hour, his wife Delois, who's also his manager and now a really good friend, cut him off and said, "Tommy, shut up. Glenn, why are you here?" "Tommy will talk all night long if you let him, but we need to know why you're here." And I said, "Look, I'm a conceptual artist, and I'll say for the audience to give context, I like to say that I use art and systems and communities associated with art to investigate some of the most difficult and pressing issues of our time, because in the art world, there's not many KPIs we can rigorously imagine, in our jobs as artists and our jobs as a community and everyone being here. Our jobs is to facilitate radical imagination, And sometimes, however, ideas that we come up with at the studio merit bigger audiences, and that's when the expansive part of my practice comes in, and as you'll see. And so I sat down and I said to him, after they put me on the spot, I said, "I don't really have anything to pitch you. I'm not here to pitch you anything, but I have an observation, if I may." And they said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, it strikes me that you live in a bit of a time bubble." And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I was born after that happened, so for me it's always been a symbol, but for you it's very personal. You shook my hand with that hand, like you brush your teeth with that hand, you drive with that hand. The rest of us, we just know that hand up in the air. So what if we could collaborate on a project that happens in the now, allowing you to be a witness for the first time of this rich history, that you've created?" And they said, "What do we do next?" I said, "You come to LA and I take the arm off your body." And they're like, "What are you talking about? We're gonna do voodoo." I was like, No. I'm just gonna cast. I'm gonna make a cast of the arm." And so that's him in the casting facility, casting his arm. And then 9 months later, we produced a large-scale sculpture called Bridge, which is this. And this is a 100-foot-long sculpture made out of 200 individual 1-meter units of Tommy Smith's arm. And I'm happy to say it's been just recently acquired by the Smithsonian Museum of American Art as the centerpiece of a new building that they're reinstalling. And it was really great. As part of that process as well, I spent 10 years working with him. Here, I'll go back. Can't go. Oh yeah, here we go. This is back. So when the cast first came out of his arm, he pointed at this little dark spot. You see that dark spot right below the glove? He pointed at that when the cast came out, and he said, "You know what that is, son?" I said, "No, what is that, sir?" He says, "It's a class muscle." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You only get that from picking cotton. So when I'm up on that podium, I flex it to let everyone know that even if you pick cotton, you're up here with me." So for me, that was very powerful, and immediately what we did was we started filming all of our work together. And we created a documentary that I'll show you a little teaser of that is available on Apple and Stars, Emmy-nominated documentary. As part of that process, there was a whole bunch of correcting of histories that we tried to accomplish. We like to think of the bridge as a connection between the past and the future and the present. It's a bridge to equality, Tommy calls it. And one of the things we did was he had never been on the cover of a Wheaties box. And so I called the CEO of Wheaties, and I said, you need to get on the right side of history, and over 18 months negotiated with them to actually launch the first ever artist-designed Wheaties box. We needed about 1.4 billion social impressions, and it was 200% sales, like the most successful Wheaties box they've had. We also called our friends over at Beats and did a Beats headphone collaboration that ended up getting 4.5 billion impressions. And it was the first Beats headphones that Dr. Dre ever gifted to people. We gifted it to the NBA, and inside, you don't have it here, but inside I made the L in Glenn when I put my name, it made it the Lakers L. So if y'all, that was when we won the championship. So we ended up, as I mentioned, making a film called Withdrawn Arms, and this is a little bit of a trailer. So as part of when we started working together, Delois, his wife, looked at me and said, we have 3 goals to this partnership. And I didn't have any goals. I was playing it by ear and figuring out what we're going to do. And they said, what are they? I'm happy to help. And they said, 1, we want to meet Oprah. 2, we want to be in the Smithsonian. Y'all know how that went out. But they said, and 3, we want to meet the president. And this is 2015, so we're clear on which president. And so. As it turns out, I spent a lot of time with Oprah Winfrey doing a bunch of projects with her, and I had seen her 2 weeks after I was given this request command order. And I saw Oprah, and I said, Oprah, I'm working with Tommy Smith, and Oprah's fantastic. She was like, Tommy Smith. She's like, I'm happy to meet him. And I said, when? She said, tomorrow. I said, that's amazing. And so, again, as I do, I pulled out my phone, and I booked 2 tickets for Tommy to come to LA to meet Oprah, and I called Tommy. And I said, hey, out of those 3 requests, I got you the first one done. And he said, what? I said, got you a meeting with Oprah in the morning. And he said, I'm too old to get on a plane right now. I said, no, you're not. No one's too old to get on a plane to go see Oprah in the morning. And he passed. Now, if we work together for any reason and you ask me to do 3 impossible things and I do the first one and you pass, I kind of think I'm off the hook for all 3 of them, right? That's sort of the way it works. Not so much. A year later, I remember where I was standing in my studio in February, and the phone rings, and now it's 2016, and it's Delois, and he says, I want to remind you, you're on the clock. I say, what does that mean? And she says, I want to meet the president, not the ex-president. And so I called everyone that I knew that knew President Obama, and the answer I got was everything from no to hell no, and then finally I called every day, and finally it was like, we'll get to him in September, and I said, well, I hope he's campaigning for someone else in September, and finally they said, if you can get to DC on official business, let us know, we'll up your security clearance to Oval, and we'll tell the president you're here, and then if he wants to meet you, he'll let you in. And they didn't know that I had just met Lonnie Bunch, and Lonnie was building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and most notably did not have anything yet from Tommy, because Tommy didn't know how that institutional giving worked. And so I brokered the deal to give half of Tommy's archive into the Smithsonian, and Lonnie said, well, great, we'll send our art handlers to your studio to go pick up all the stuff. I said, no, it's okay. We'll hand deliver it to the Smithsonian. Like, we'll go to the Smithsonian and we'll hand deliver it. We just need security clearance. And so we got the clearance. And then on my birthday, we were invited to the Oval Office to meet President Obama. And I actually made this drawing for him, which is a drawing of Tommy Smith passing the baton to a 4th runner. And it was a world record relay. And we were able to give it to POTUS. And on the back, Tommy wrote a really beautiful inscription. He wrote, I can only imagine the length of passage, but most importantly, the baton has not been dropped. Congratulations on a magnificent 8. I can say that a few weeks later after our visit, President Obama went on stage for the DNC, and he said, now I'm going to be a private citizen, I'm going to pass the baton. And Delois and Tommy called me crying, and Valerie Jarrett's office called and said that the president had said the phrase "pass the baton" in 12 speeches in the 2-week time frame since our visit. And so in our film, I said, I can't take credit for influencing, obviously, the President of the United States speech writing. I can just give you the evidence, and it happened. Usually I end with this, but this is an NFT story, so I'm telling you NFTs. This is like my humble brag story about like taking a picture with the president. And I usually say that there's 4 people smiling and not 5, and I'm the one not smiling. And that's because when President Obama said, guys, let's take a photo, I was trying to be a good producer. There were 6 people in the room. I didn't know who the 6th fellow was the photographer. But I was trying to really hustle to get Tommy to where I'm standing in the middle. And President Obama sees me running around like a fool in the office. And he says, Glenn, from the moment y'all walked in here, it's been meet Tommy, meet Tommy. Come here, birthday boy. But I didn't practice on how to stand with the President of the United States. So I was like, I didn't go to the prom, so I was like, is it some prom thing? Are we doing B-boy? But his hand is extended to me like this, so my hand reciprocates like this. But if you notice, there's no hand there, because somehow my hand slipped into his jacket, and I'm in his shirt, and I'm looking at my feet, and I'm giving him a little squeeze, and he starts smiling, and I'm looking at my feet, and half my brain is like, get your hands off the president, and the other half is like, your hand is on the president, and I look up in shock, and that's the photo, and then once the photo's done, President Obama says, guys, good to see you, and you're done. So anyways, and so we got back to Tommy's place, though, after this pass the baton story moment, and this is actually the baton that Tommy used to break the world records, and he had it in his house. Again, from the story, thousands of photos in his house of the salute, but one object. Really that was art, and it was this object, and he had used that red 70s label maker tape and put like his teammates' names and their split times and the different world records on there. He left the tape from when they were, passing it, and I thought, wow, what a beautiful object, not just the patina, but the memory and the imbibing an object with meaning value, and also it looked like a lightsaber. And if y'all don't know, like every Jedi has his own lightsaber. And so right around that time, we were looking at this. We were getting asked to do NFTs now. NFTs were really big in collectibles. Obviously, we're here to have a discussion about art in the sports world as well. There's a history of trading cards, and so Tommy was getting asked to do NFTs, and we were not interested in doing, let's say, decorative NFTs for just commercial value. We were interested in using a smart contract as a conceptual basis for a project. So we said, what would we do? And so we took this concept of his baton, and we actually deconstructed it using sneaker culture, and created multiple options of grip tapes, of colorways, and algorithmically generated thousands, over 7,800 different individual batons on 4 different teams with different names that we put on there, because we said, what would be the legacy team if we were going to create legacy teams now? And we created, a spectacular coalition of activists and philanthropic partners. Latasha Brown, Yolanda Caraway, Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mom, and David Johns, Derek Johnson. You name it. We organized a coalition whose constituency supported 80 million activists on the street. And when we went to mint, all the proceeds went to directly through the smart contract into the wallets of these nonprofits, and we actually spent a good amount of time onboarding the nonprofits into the world of crypto. Really, both as a practical gesture, they all received some money, but also wanting to show, and we'll get into this when we talk in our conversation about what are the value of some of these projects right now that are outside of just the immediate capital value. It was more important for us to take a stand and actually deliver on a promise of, transparency in the blockchain and using smart contracts as a conceptual medium. And so then what we have been doing is hosting ongoing conversations. So at my gallery, I did a show at my gallery Pace last year, and we had a fireside chat with Bray Baker, Latasha Brown, Yasha Shabazz, and Insei, who fought Latasha and Insei, who are killing it right now in Atlanta. So that's sort of just the basics of Pass the Baton. So when we start talking about it later, you know what it's about. So thank you so much for having me.
So that was just a way to sort of set the stage in terms of some of the projects, where we're coming from, some of the ideas that we've all been working on. Glenn was just speaking about this project, Pass the Baton, which I knew about last December and was really struck by, and have slyly included it in a number of articles that were about other things because I want more people to know about it. And I'm going to use it as sort of a launching pad because, Glenn, in the essay that you wrote about the project, you said, blockchain is a fundamental evolution in epistemology and a new way of knowing. And obviously that intrigued me, you might have guessed from my earlier remarks. But both of you have done NFTs, right? And really it's about this technology of blockchain. And so what I wanted to ask you was, what did you learn in the process of really engaging with this technology? Because, as someone who thinks about it from outside, like not using it, I think about the infrastructure and I theorize around it, but there's something quite different from when you're actually embedded in trying to, have a project work on it. And so I guess the question I have is really, what did you learn through the use of blockchain that made you think there's a lot of potential here? But at the same time, what did you learn that made you think, right, this isn't the answer to everything? Like, what else still needs to be figured out with it?
Sure, thank you, Charlotte. I think one of the things I learned first and foremost was how deeply uninterested I was in the sort of market angle. I remain uninterested in it. What I am deeply fascinated by, and what I learned through each of these projects, and I'm currently working on a project at LACMA actually, is on the subject, is what about blockchain technologies affords other types, how can we really investigate these ideas of accountability and agreements and all the things that really interest me way well outside of the art world or any kind of even artistic, like formal concerns. How could this be deployed and explored and developed and built into more equitable systems? So for me, it became directly connected to more equitable futures and how to grapple with the very complex questions it raises. You know, there's a kind of techno-utopianism around the idea of decentralization, and it's just not that simple. So for me, you know, and that a lot of that techno-utopianism is libertarian in nature. And I've had the great fortune of meeting with some environmental toxicologists, mycologists, and one of the things I hear consistently is that, and the reason why I look to blockchain is, at least for points of intersection and overlap, is that when we look at natural systems, those systems are concerned with the health and well-being of the whole system, not specific parts of the system, which is why there's this uncomfortable kind of chewy tension between that, which is built into the structure of of a lot of Web3 technologies, and then the impulse toward and sort of influence of a capitalist market. And those things are at odds. So I find that very compelling and difficult, and that's how I've sort of, I guess, been grappling with it ever since.
Well, thank you so much for that question and your remarks also, because I'd say for me, when I wrote that, what I meant was invoking, you know, my interest in sort of the parallel histories and understanding where histories intersect. And just by way of quick historical refresher as well, you know, prior to 1968, most computer science and knowledge production was called process-based computer programming, which was like, if you learned programming, you probably learned 10, print hello, 20, go to 10, run, hello, 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 hello. That's recursive, but it's linear. You know, it's called process-based. In 1968, 69, you know, in the world of technology and engineering, the concept of what they call object-oriented production was developed. And I've always, and I did a talk of the Carnegie years ago, I always was curious and interested in the fact that, and I don't think it's coincidental, that the world in 1968 understood a landscape of diversity in a different way at the same time when in the academic sphere and in engineering, we learned how to know in a different way. We learned how to know in a modular way. Pre-1968, the idea of plug and play your mouse, your different parts, that didn't exist. You got a thing, and a thing was a thing. And what I meant there is, you know, if you trace the history of Web 1, 2, and 3, and just, I find that this is like a little bit helpful when we have some of these NFT conversations. Like Web 1.0 was like, I need to go to a website. My computer hits a server somewhere in the world, and that server sends back whatever image I was looking for. Web 2.0 is, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to have a user account, and it's going to be custom to me. You know, Web 3.0 and this distributed databasing, you know, is the entire application, everything is distributed. You know, nothing is in one singular location. And for me, as we grapple as a society with the embracing of things that the generation of activists have fought for years in terms of personal pronouns, even as a small but huge example, you know, this notion of how to embrace diversity against the totalitarian unity, you know, it strikes me that the conversation about thinking about the challenges of blockchain are very relevant, right? And so when I say that we are learning to know in a different way, as a societal whole, we are learning to know in a lot of different ways. And in the same breath that we can dismiss NFTs or blockchain is the same ways that older generations dismiss the application of pronouns or the questioning of historic knowns. And these things that when we grew up, they were known. Like, and now a lot of things that are known are not known anymore. And I think that's a cool thing. So.
Can I just add to that? Because I think it's such a great segue that actually that this question of knowing and using it for knowing in a moment of such pronounced misinformation, disinformation, which has been deployed for obviously a means of oppression and mass manipulation, blockchain also affords this opportunity to actually encode and protect certain types of knowledge. For example, war crimes. We just hosted a Web3 summit at Vellum, and we had the great privilege of hearing from Jonathan Dotan, who runs Starling Labs, and they are using blockchain to record, to document war crimes in a way that is impossible otherwise. And I think about, I don't know if anybody's heard of Filecoin Green, but this is a really, really ambitious project that has been spearheaded by, among other things, the founder of IPFS, Juan Benet, which intends to create a kind of global carbon ledger and to get super granular and transparent about carbon use and accountabilities, but at scale and at speed, in a way that, like, if you're just trading Excel spreadsheets and, it can take years when, as Charlotte said, I think we've got, or I think you mentioned this, 8 years to figure a lot of this out. I think we have 8 years to reduce carbon emissions by 40% or something. That's impossible under using current systems. So I do think that there are a lot of kind of less sexy, perhaps, applications and ways of knowing, recording, documenting, but that could have a profound, and speaking of radical imagination, a really radical effect on our collective future.
So the Glasgow summit last year on climate, one of the things that they were thinking about was, carbon markets have this terrible history because of the ways in which they were just badly used and profit-oriented and whatnot. But the notion of the fact that we need to think about how can we tabulate carbon, but also potentially how can we make carbon a type of value that switches it around. And so one of the things that they were looking at and they were talking about was actually blockchain as a way of being able to track carbon. And so various projects have since developed blockchain projects that are, for example, trying to figure out how you could make it that by basically by enclosing carbon basically within a sort of coin system, you would make it so that you can't buy off that market, right? So you can't do the trade, which would mean you would be protecting forests, basically with the idea of trying to scale it up so that it becomes increasingly hard to trade carbon, which would force creative practices and businesses and industries to think about new systems, right? And I think one of the things that I'm interested in around technologies and some of the uses of them is how they can potentially force us to think differently, right? And one of the reasons I think that that's really important is because we get them and we're told how to use them, and then we use them that way. And it's really easy not to recognize the way they reshaped how we're thinking or how we're living or how we are moving until it's become normal and suddenly it's taken away and there's that weird day where you're walking around without your phone and you feel itchy and uncomfortable and you don't know how to do all the things you normally do, right? Because we've been trained into them. One of the things I'm trying to highlight is there's been so much written about these moments in time around how technologies impacted us. We have the chance now to really look at them and think through, hey, how could it be different, right? How could we react against that? And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is we have a symbiotic relationship with this, right? And symbiosis is a really important concept to think through in terms of how we can relate in a more ecologically whole manner. And both of you have done projects to this. Nancy, Mushroom Cloud, which you showed us, and you didn't present it, but just because it's going on right now in LA, A Forest for the Trees is also very much about trying to think through a forest for the trees, not for you to go look at and enjoy, but like a forest for the trees, right? This is this type of symbiotic thinking. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how these immersive installation practices, these use of technologies, get you to start, like, what is your embodied thinking experience as you are working with these systems and these means that help you start to think symbiotically, such that you can then produce it in the projects?
Well, yeah, thank you for the plug. Yeah, Forest for the Trees, downtown LA, forestfortrees.com. Get tickets now. No, yeah, the Forest for the Trees is a large-scale immersive project, and I would say, without commandeering the entire conversation, you know, it is meant to present a lived experience. You know, where instead of and really challenge the ideas of you know, art making in terms of as art making as maps. You know, a cartographic trade. You know, this idea of owning knowledge. And the idea of owning maps and feeling comfortable with devices and things, but actually having presence and being there. And so the best feedback we've gotten from people about our presentation of issues, because I would say it's not an artwork per se of mine, it is an art project that a number of collaborators, you know, native tribal members, musicians, you know, it's dozens of artists collaborated to make that project, and I was one of the producers and director. But it is about immersing yourself so that you feel the issue instead of know the issue. Michael Govan from LACMA brought in a group, and he gave us, I thought, the best compliment. He says, you know, a good artwork might make you think about something. This work makes you feel, you know, the thing, and you know, that was the experimental goal of that project, is to provide a lived experience as opposed to a fully mediated one where you know, we're not trying to be at the bottom of a social media funnel. You know, we're trying to, you know, be at the top of one where you know, prioritizing us being in a room together and us seeing things with our eyes. So.
I think that's so beautiful, and I love the just even the way you talk about collaboration. I think for me, it's really acknowledging that this is a collaboration with machines, with algorithms. And one of the a book that's really influenced me recently, I highly recommend it to everyone here. It's called Ways of Being by James Bridle. And his book, without ruining anything for you, opens up with, he's in Greece, he's in this pristine forest, and he's working, well, he's not working with, but he's tracking an AI that is looking for the best drilling points for drilling, because it turns out there's some oil reserve there. And his initial provocation is, why can't we use these tools that mediate our lives, that algorithmically mediate our lives and control our behaviors? Why can't we use them toward much less extractive ends, toward much more empowering ends? And I think that's a key question. And I don't see us as, I mean, I think to the way that you frame this conversation, Charlotte, you know, looking back to a day without algorithms, we're not in an algocracy yet, but you know, it's a fool's errand. This is where we are. And so how do we take this moment to be thoughtful, to be intentional, and to reshape these tools in a way that allows us to build, not to have some inexorable future, which is dystopic, but to use them to our advantage as partners, as collaborators. I love this one section in the book where he basically talks about computers being made of silicon, and that the computers themselves are stone, and he says they speak the language of stone, that we are all made of a group of elements, and as that grouping of elements, we need to figure out how to work together in these new ways. And one of the things that I thought a really beautiful recent example, there's an artist named, an indigenous artist named Joel Garcia. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's a wonderful artist. He just created a piece in AR, which we hosted as part of my residency in Lancaster. And you know, he had to retrain Midjourney and maybe DALL-E, I'm not sure, to generate any images he could find that were decolonized, that were not racist, that were not grounded in some, you know, hyper, you know, heteropatriarchal white vision of history, to create this beautiful landscape that he then cited on tribal lands in Lancaster. And it took quite a bit of effort, but he did it. And it's possible. And I think that that's part of the work. I think that's part of how, and that's just a tiny fraction of how we might start to go about doing that.
But I think one of the things I just want to push you both on is, you are doing this every day. And your lived experience is partly tracking your own experiences with the computer, with the installation, like having to plot out the types of experiences you want others to have to get them to have that embodied moment, right? That ergonomic awe, that kind of feeling thing, not just thinking thing. And so what, for the sake of, those who don't necessarily do that, how do you notice it in yourself? When do you notice the relationship to the computer? When do you notice the relationship to the screen or to whatever the technology is that you're using? How it is beginning to seep into the way you move or the way you think, the way you engage with others, because it's that attention that you then produce into these art projects, but that you can also share in terms of how we can create some of that space to be more attentive.
Well, that's a good question. I think for me, it's the performance of life, right? I mean, I have a critical distance with being with the machines and how we work in the studio. I'd say, my practice prioritizes humans, and we prioritize connections between people and empathy and this notions of presence. I mean, we were just talking before about a project that I produced with my performance art partner, Derek Delgadio. It's called In and of Itself. It was a play at the Geffen, and now it's a movie on Hulu.
It's incredible. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it.
Yeah, it was a magic film ostensibly, but it was a platform for, and the reason why it was very successful is because many people who've seen it is like, I cried so much. And I said, I've watched that film, I watched about 80 shows live. We did 740 sold out shows in a row. I watched personally 80 of them. Derek performed all of them, and I cried every time, and they're like, you cried and you guys wrote the material. I said, yeah, but the material we wrote was just a platform for people who showed up to show us how amazing humans can be. And we were always surprised every day at how wonderful people are. And when you watch the film on Hulu, you're like, this is not about what we did at all as artists. We were able to construct a platform for this. But it was about how people interact. And so for me, having lived through, several generations of this technology now, I think there's like a symbiotic criticality, with this notion of also empowerment and how it works and watching trajectories and I think you launched this conversation at a very robust historical trajectory, that we all find ourselves in now. And so, that's what I do.
Yeah, I love this question because embodied consciousness is an obsession of mine. And I would say that first and foremost, back to ergonomics, this is like my busted finger, I'm pretty convinced now, is from holding my stupid little black mirror, which is unusually heavy for some reason. So it has changed the way our bodies, and they've studied this, it's changed the way we look down, our, strain in our neck. I mean, they think that we're gonna develop these like hyper strong pinkies because like in a few generations from holding like this, which is terrifying. But that is part of evolutionary adaptation, and we are developing these kind of evolutionary fitness to cooperate and collaborate with these tools and these technologies. But I would say as someone who has a very intimate, sounds like the wrong word. I mean it, I don't mean it in the traditional sense, but someone who works intimately, let's say, with augmented reality, I find it to be an incredibly visceral medium. I feel that, part of the beauty of shared immersive space, especially in AR, particularly in sites that are themselves charged, is the feeling of the soil underfoot, and the smell of the air, the texture of the air, the sounds, the ambient sounds. What is that? That is all engaging with an augmented reality, a reality that is not better per se, but might be richer, deeper, revelatory, complicated by this added digital layer. And I will tell you without any shame that augmented reality has moved me to tears on more than one occasion. And I was stunned that when I installed Corpus, I think Peter was there, I after we launched it, I burst into tears. I had felt such a kinship and connection with this 5-story future human, and it seemed like science fiction to me. I was embarrassed, well, I'm telling you this without shame now, but I was like, what's going on? But something happens when those lines are blurred, when life, as you say, the performance of life becomes an act of hybridity, and you live into that hybridity. And the last thing, there was one other thing I wanted to say about that. I would just say that the most sort of obvious proof I have of this is from virtual reality, drawing in virtual reality. Once I started drawing in virtual reality, I saw all of my analog drawings, my graphite drawings on paper, change inexorably and indelibly. And I think and I believe that drawing in 360, drawing digitally, has fundamentally altered my neuroanatomy. So all of those ways in which we are entangled and our practices are entangled with it, I think it becomes difficult to extricate or separate ourselves from its influence.
It's one of the ways that I like to think about this. I had a conversation with someone earlier this week about it, is there's this wonderful expression, to be all thumbs, right? It's when you're being clumsy and awkward and whatever. And I had the realization the other day that I spend a huge amount of my time being all thumbs, and that maybe that might actually indicate something about the world in which we're living, that there's this way in which we are all thumbs, and we might need to think about the intellectual impact of that. I want to bring this back, though, to, so much of what both of you are talking about is storytelling, and how it is that you're trying to present these different types of narratives. And I'm from New York, but I did my LA research, and so I can say that Netflix has a sustainability effort that they've been doing, and part of that is actually through storytelling. They made a commitment to ensure that part of their production always was committed to stories around climate issues. And in 2020, they identified 160 million households who had watched narratives that were focused on learning about new issues and with the climate. And I bring this up because it's, to bring it back just for a moment to this notion of we're in the middle of a revolution, and it's very difficult to be aware of that when you're in it, because it's just the life you're living. And yet the choices that we make are so much a part of what is going to come. And I think that's part of what I've been trying to emphasize, and I've been trying to, sort of get the two of you to talk about. It's the fact that 50 years ago, in 1972, a group of scholars came out with a book called Limits to Growth. And they identified, by using basically computer modeling that was just becoming available at the time, a lot of they sort of outlined 12 scenarios of population growth and resource depletion, and they sort of presented some of the issues that needed to be addressed, and they made some suggestions, and they sort of said, okay, governments, you're gonna have economic issues, you're gonna have political issues, and in a 20-year follow-up that they did, they could sort of be like, hey, look, we're right, we predicted this stuff, and that's really kind of happening. And in the 30-year update that came out in 2002, and obviously we're some years past that now, one of the things that was quite interesting to me was that they talked about how their focus initially had been rational analysis, data gathering, systems theory, computer modeling, and that as scientists, they were really uncomfortable with the fact that what they now saw was necessary, and so necessary that they dedicated a portion of the final chapter to describing each of these things. And what they called for was visioning, networking, truth-telling, learning, and loving. Now, those were the criteria that they saw as being truly important parts of how we were going to go forward. In addition to the research and the science that would continue to be called upon to highlight for all of us what we need to do. So if you're not familiar with Limits to Growth, may I make that my book recommendation to you all?
I'll just plug my own movies.
But with that, I do know that you all may have questions for any of us, and so I want to turn it over to you all.
Thank you very much. Incredibly interesting. And as I guess part organizer of this event, sadly, we can't sort of keep going for much longer than about 5 or 10 minutes. But I guess two things. One is I think we promised some of the people coming today that we'd learn a little bit about Ethereum Merge. So perhaps you might spend a minute or two on that. And two, just sort of quick question. You've talked so interestingly about sort of being fully immersed in the medium that you work with, and that medium is often, digital and chugging, enormous amounts of electricity. Do you ever have a compulsion, a desire to turn the switch off? To turn the switch off and to just have the power off? And
Well, I'll answer the first one, and then we'll talk about turning stuff off. And I know, and I'm not going to answer about Ethereum, but I will talk about address the energy consumption, sort of, which happens to be the standard conversation for every one of these conversations that we have. Is like, oh, it uses so much electricity, and I'll relate that to Netflix, and I'll do a little triangulation of storytelling. And I'll say that, I think it is quite appropriate and right that we're in the middle of a revolution. And I think it's important also to not make the equivalency of artists and scientists, only to say that they're fantastic and they work conjoined. Science requires proof, art doesn't. Art requires absurdity, imagination, and radicality. And I think that's why it's a powerful conversation and combination. And I tell a story about the Netflix when I sometimes address this notion of power consumption and NFTs, for example, which in a way talks to Ethereum. And I talk about, Netflix used to send DVDs out in the mail. And if y'all don't know that, many of you do, but many of you maybe don't know that. Netflix started out as like a post office company, and you used to go there and you'd get a DVD and then you send it back, and what a ridiculous consumption of resources and fuel. And then they started streaming, and when they started streaming, and ESPN, which I guess is not going away, sports, started streaming stuff. There was, in fact, in the internet world, in the digital world, what was a crisis, and it sounded something like this. Wow, this new technology is crazy. Servers are melting down. We can't afford to do it. It's causing too much energy consumption, because when you streamed a sports event, it would go all the way to Starwave in Seattle, no matter where you were in the world. If you streamed a movie from Netflix, it came to New York and went through all it. So if 1 million people in LA wanted to stream, whatever, anything, it would go all the way through all these servers. And a friend of mine who actually passed away in 9/11 coming out to see me, his name is Danny Lewin. He created a company called Akamai. He was a young grad student at MIT, and he created the concept called caching. And caching is like, effectively, the simple version is, hey, every morning, let's just put whatever is the hottest thing in New York server, put it on an LA server right in downtown. And so when the LA community wants to get that information, they just get it from LA. And he saved the internet. Because he actually, and he literally is credited as saving the internet because he reduced the wear by orders of magnitude on all the different servers, and he used beta traffic was cut by an order of magnitude. And I say, like, right now, as artists who are challenged with creating provocations, we are having a dialogue about power consumption in distributed technology because of, in ways, Mr. Beeple. And Mr. Beeple was in service of a market to create a Wall Street Journal story to explode this conversation for us. Whether you think the art's good or not, it's certainly historically important and a milestone. And so we're having a conversation about power consumption in distributed technology in a new way of thinking, because of a provocation, from art. And I said, and I've said this, and it was proven to me yesterday. I've been saying for the last year when talking about NFTs, there is a young grad student right now who now knows that this problem exists and is putting their energies into thinking this problem, just the same way Danny was when he was at MIT creating Akamai, trying to solve ESPN's and Netflix's problem. And I happened to be at University of Washington, doing a site visit for a new crazy project, and the fellow there, who's the head of engineering and science, he walks me into a lab. And I'm familiar with 3D printers. Maybe y'all familiar with 3D printers. This man had a row of DNA printers. And what they were doing is they figured out how to transcode data into DNA. Now, pixels and bits are ones and zeros. DNA are 4-axis. So he says on a per molecule basis, it is orders of magnitude more dense and more storage efficient. And I said, what do you mean? He says, yeah, we have seasons of TV series embedded in strands of DNA. And it takes a little bit longer to decode. It's not real time. It takes about an hour to decode, and I said, Seinfeld? It's like a Seinfeld DNA strand? He says, yeah, pretty much. They're actually transcoding media assets
into strands of DNA that take about an hour to asymmetrically decode. And that problem only exists because I was talking to him, we were in the Paul Allen School, and I was saying when I met Paul Allen years ago, he was like trying to archive every TV show ever made. He had these big hard drives bigger than this room, like data banks. If he doesn't have that problem because Netflix doesn't exist, we don't get to a point where a grad student figures out that a DNA strand is 4 axes instead of 2 and bits don't happen, and next thing you know, we're gonna be, I guess putting our hard drives in the refrigerator? Who knows? But now we have organic hard drives in a way, and this is just the curve of technology that we are sitting in. And what I loathe to do is be on the part of like condemning and again expecting answers to happen like that, because that is sort of a Western colonial time frame when in fact everything we're doing is happening so fast. So that's my little story about energy.
Yeah, there's no way to improve on that. I mean, I would just say that's exactly right, and it has been and was artists leading the charge, highlighting these issues of consumption. But like you said, it's not pointing fingers and blaming is not productive. There's so much exciting development right now, and I think that's really important.
I think the thing that I want to point out, and the reason I'm sort of against the culture of blaming is because I think it's an oversimplistic way of thinking about what the solution is. If you can just find the boogie monster in the corner and eradicate that boogie monster, then everything will be okay. And the reason it's a really problematic way of thinking is because it reiterates, actually, from my perspective, one of these things around agri-logistics, which is that we are not of a whole. Basically, all of us in this room were culpable. We are participants in a system that is out of equilibrium, and that makes it impossible for everyone on the planet to have some basic material needs met, even though that could actually be possible given the resources and technologies available today. So one of the reasons I say that is because I think as soon as we can position ourselves from a place of culpability and recognize that every single day you are doing things that are not great, and every single day you're doing some things that are really helping, it starts to move the conversation in another direction, and that's really important. The other thing I'll say about lights and turning them off, I get weird guilt complexes, and I have this thing about turning all the lights off and so on and so forth. But about a year ago, I got a text message in New York City. There was a heat wave going on, and it was asking if all households would not use their microwaves and turn off their air conditioners. And I got livid because individuals are not really the problem here. We have Times Square fully lit across this heat wave. And one of the reasons it's fully lit is because those billboards, the technologies in them can't simply be turned off. The electricity power, it would break some of those screens to just flick them off. You can't do that. And so the question becomes, oh, that's interesting, you can't do that. Can some great graduate student out there figure out how to solve that problem so that we could? It's the fact that there are towns all over this country trying to solve this, but why are the buildings all lit up all night long? What is that about? In other words, I would like to shift the conversation. By all means, please do keep recycling, right? Your individual recycling is good, please do. But that's not where the burden of responsibility mostly lays. And we need to shift away from blaming individuals to looking at the larger systems that need massive change. So yes, okay. One more question, sorry. We're very enthusiastic about this.
Do you think that using AR or works that are AR developed brings us, helps us to recognize that culpability and would be a better tool, is a wonderful tool moving forward to communicate that and
For what it's worth, the United Nations has committed in a pretty large scale to virtual reality and some augmented reality precisely because they, after a few test runs, I think back in 2016, identified how significant it was in changing people's minds around certain global issues. And so, yeah,
Well,
Yeah.
I have to say thank you for seeing that piece. I didn't make it, but I saw it as well, and I'm Japanese, and I'm having a show at the museum next year. That piece is, for me, one of the most powerful AR pieces I've ever seen, besides hers. As an immersive indictment. Because I'm Japanese and my family was in camp, but as living in a Western colonial framework and a colonial sort of narrative, like you understand absolutely, or you feel an empathy towards the viewer, and it when people talk about critique of documentaries, and you talk about the positionality of the lens of the camera, being the performer of that extractive lens, you feel so bad. I encourage you all to go see it. After you go see Forest for the Trees, it's about 2 minutes away. You can just go across the bridge.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think that's the power and the opportunity of AR, hands down. There's this idea of idea activation, and one of the things that happens when you experience really rigorous work in AR, and I can say this having curated and co-curated a bunch of AR exhibitions at this point, but specifically one I'm thinking of in New Orleans called Battlegrounds, that coupling of image to site or to environment is itself, because it exists in this non-space. It's here and not here. We need this visual prosthesis. It ends up living in your consciousness. It ends up living as memory. And for that reason, it's incredibly powerful. And I think that's one of the things that I hope people continue to explore and really push and lean into with AR. I think that's certainly been my experience.
I've been told that we need to wrap up, so I'm going to. But I would like to just close briefly with the fact that you may have noticed I have avoided the word sustainability. And I do so intentionally because I think it's a really problematic word. Sustaining our current situation is not an option. I talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium because that is where we're at. If we want people to have access to basic material needs met on this planet, to be able to have other species continue to live, and I kind of do mean we, I know we is a weird word, but us in this room, we're going to have to not sustain what we have, but reduce it significantly. So I understand that the movement around sustainability is, making some really good headway, but I would encourage people to think about how that vocabulary retains a set of logistics that are maybe counterproductive to what we're looking to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.